But again, if an artist has a very specific way they want the work presented, I usually get the work intact, solid, and framed, and most people don't, mess with that. Otherwise, like I had mentioned earlier, the artists really rely on the gallerist a lot for their advice and their opinion about how to present the work.
Jim and then Kate. Well, I think the word vintage it would refer to being made within 5 years of the negative date. But I think your question is what would its value be, and where would you place that value? Or if it's the artist's intent to print it only. Right. Because the thing about value in photography is that there's value on rarity, and then there's value on concept and idea of art. And, finding the place where those things meet is sometimes difficult, especially in historical work, in that case, for example. But as far as setting prices and what's more valuable and which is more legitimate, I don't know that I don't know that I can answer that question. I think you'd have to talk to the artist and as a curator feel comfortable with what you're suggesting or presenting for a proposal to the institution. So, I would have to make a justification for acquiring the artist-intended work that was actually printed, 30 years after the original idea came into vogue, and then you're sort of responsible for the transparency of that when you show it. So you say the image is 1967, chromogenic print printed 2010, or what have you. As long as it's clear, then I think that helps us, or it makes us at least feel better about showing the work. But is that, that's kind of my point of view on it, but the Met probably may have a different point of view.
Actually, I would hesitate to speak for the curators at the Met. How about I do it that way?
Abstain from that.
What about from your viewpoint?
About value?
Yeah. The newer ones, okay?
Which would be more valuable to the market, do you think?
A newer print as opposed to an older print. I don't know. I really don't. Kind of like we were saying about Stephen Shore, it's like for some artists looking at the prints they made in the 70s, whether it's, the color shift or whatever it is, they feel like that's not representative of them anymore. I remember Edwin Haupt did a show of, I believe it was vintage Joel Meyerowitz, maybe, prints, and they were ugly. They were just, or it was Shore, I think it was Meyerowitz, but they were just, had really turned. But the idea was that they were vintage prints. They were of that era, and there was an importance and value, high value, placed on that. But you looked at it just aesthetically, and you thought, my God, this is not what it was when it was printed. I know that. And so how can you value that if you don't value it as just as an artifact, as an archaeological artifact?
It becomes about rarity, and how many of those prints were made in 1970, and how many, so how much would it cost? But as a curator, I also have ethical problems. Okay, so Zoe, I'm sure you'd be like, oh, let's just reprint it. But what if you print it totally differently, after a point of 20 years, and so then to the point where it becomes almost a picture about something different, and you're an institution and you're trying to represent the history of the medium. So, and it was really important in 1975 that this picture was made. So if you lose that object, how ethical is it then to ask the artist? Even if the artist is like, oh, that's terrible, let me reprint a new one. not being on it, or isn't there a problem there?
I think it would depend on the situation. I think, I mean, it fully depends on it, and it also, I think it's, that's important in terms of how photography is a burgeoning art and the continuum. And so I think both of those objects are important.
Right.
They're both important, they're both interesting, and it directly relates to the history of the technology and the medium and the artist's intent. And certainly an artist can change their concept as to what they want to show and to what the intent was for this print, but it doesn't negate the importance of the first one as an object in its own right. But I wouldn't necessarily say that if an artist is involved in the process of saying, I'd like to reprint this and show this now, I think that that's not a problem, that's not cheating. It's still artist intent, it's still coming from same source material, and the presentation is kind of part of the artist's own continuum in relation to the continuum of photography.
But then it
That
becomes
was
an
pretty
object.
articulate. I really knocked
great.
that out.
That was great.
But then it becomes an object of 2010 and no longer the object of 1975. So it represents the artist at that point.
With being such a young field that maybe we should just adapt with the print field adapt to this fall state.
That could be, yeah.
Oh, that's a good idea. That's a good idea.
More the abstract, more like music.
Mm-hmm.
What is the original?
Huh.
There are certain artists like Zoe who I would say suggest fall into that category of that reproduction of the piece is maybe more akin to music.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a different way of approaching things. There's the transient nature of the work itself, of the medium itself, and there's the notion of the moment being captured in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so is it about that moment, or is it about the material and its nature of the medium?
There's always the artifact versus the concept, and it's finding the place where those two things both get their just due. And I think we all are kind of saying, well, it depends. And that's because it depends on the artist.